So now to formally start our conference, it is an honor and a joy to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Professor Miroslav Volf from Yale Divinity School. He's one of the most celebrated theologians today and works in the intersection of faith and culture. There's a lot to say about Miroslav's work by way of introduction, but in thinking about it, I decided instead that I would lift up an observation, something you will observe today. When Miroslav speaks, he uses his hands and his arms a great deal. And there's one hand motion in particular that I think says a great deal about his work. And it goes like this. He'll do it better, but it goes like this. Right? I've watched him many times. It goes like that. I think it expresses beautifully a lot of aspects of his work. It expresses in a hand motion that we are called to bring together that which is separated and not reconciled. It speaks to the how we are imbued by our Creator to shape our common life and the common good, and how it is always vulnerable because we human creatures are finite and broken. And ultimately it speaks to being called to being open vessels, not closed, open to divine grace. So it is a delight to have you here. And we look forward to your words today on the question, do Christians and Muslims worship the same God?
Thank you, Susan, so much. Susan has been a friend for a while now, and it's very good to see her as well as to be here with you this morning. When I was working on the question of Islam and Christianity, which started after 9/11, and I was hoping that that the question wouldn't be with us for so long, and that it wouldn't be as critical as it has continued to be through these years. But this is one of the great questions of our time, and it's one of the great questions of our time because these are the two great, numerically at least, great religions of our time, Christianity and Islam. Majority of religious folks belong to these two religions. So what I was planning to do is this. Now I'm self-conscious, right? What am I going? How's this going? Yeah, my children tease me also. You know, they tell me if somebody tied my hands in the back, it just the whole thing would collapse. I wouldn't be able to talk. I come from Mediterranean, and you know that Italians are really expressive with their hands. I'm on the other side of the Adriatic coast. We too tend to be a bit more expressive than normally Europeans or maybe some other folks are. So what I intended to do is to give you a bit of the history of my own engagement with the question, why it mattered to me so much, what I have learned, and what I think continues to be a significant significance of the theme and importance of wrestling, and what maybe areas there are that we ought to wrestle. And as I will be giving you more a personal journey, I should tell you something about myself in relationship to Islam, and that autobiographical, those two tidbits have shaped very much the way in which I think about relationship between Christianity and Islam. First, I was born. Right? Big news to you, right? Normally that's what happens with people. I was born in a fortress. And I was born in a fortress that was built as the Ottoman armies were retreating after the defeat at the gate of Vienna. And the emperors, Austro-Hungarian emperors, were then interested in building fortresses to secure that this kind of aggression will not repeat itself. And one of those fortresses was in Osijek, a town in which I was born. And as a matter of fact, I was born in that fortress and in what used to be a horse stable that was built, slightly transformed into a place suitable for humans to live. So that's a kind of one tidbit. I used to play also when we moved some 120 kilometers up. Somehow I have a... My father, who was a Pentecostal minister, moved some maybe 80 miles or so up east. There was another fortress, even larger, and as a 10-year-old boy, I used to play in its moats and go into underground tunnels, and it was really, really great. But those fortresses were reminders of enmity that existed and that in memory continued to exist between kind of Christian population and Muslim population, and they were the Ottoman Empire was always coded as Muslim, so that it became almost synonymous with Islam. My father, who I mentioned, was a Pentecostal minister. Before he became one, he was trained as a confectioner, and a lot of confectionery business was in the hands of Albanian population who were Muslims predominantly. And so he was trained and worked often for Muslims, and he would always tell me, and he would say that even years after he was a minister, the best man for whom I ever worked in my life was a Muslim. So those are the kind of two tidbits for me. On the one hand, the memory of long centuries of occupation and wars. On the other hand, kind of experience very close by of kind of beauty of the character that certainly my father did not encounter anywhere except in the Muslim community. So the kind of revival of my interest after 9/11 in Muslim-Christian relations was triggered on the one hand by you might remember, the Danish cartoons, where a kind of they were kind of cultural commentary and reaction to certain kind of reading of the presence of Islam in Western European societies. And there was the kind of derisive cartoons about the character of Islam. And the reaction was very strong of the Muslim community worldwide. The second event that occurred in the trail of this one was the so-called Regensburg Address of the then Pope Benedict XVI. And that Regensburg Address was about the relationship between faith and reason. But as a preface to this reflection on faith and reason, he gave a story and commentary on the nature of Islam, associating Islam primarily with unreason. And the story that he gives was of the conversation that happened in Constantinople, and that conversation was kind of the debate about the nature of Islam and Christianity. And there's a line in that conversation which says that Muhammad brought nothing new. Whatever new it was that Muhammad brought into the world was evil and inhuman, as was the command to spread the faith that he preached with the help of the sword. That for him was illustration of the kind of violent nature, unreasoned and therefore violent nature of Islam. Obviously that triggered itself a very strong reaction. But the reaction that was most significant for me personally, and I think was most constructive, came from a person who would become a friend of mine, Prince Ghazi of Jordan, who has gathered a group of leading Muslim scholars from all around the world, some of the most prominent Muslim leaders, and they published the so-called common word between you and us, or us and you. Some of you are aware of that document. If you aren't, it's worth reading that document. I remember that I was made aware of the document before it was actually officially published, but 2 days before. A friend of mine, non-theologians, for whatever reason, he knew about the document and was able to access the document, and he sent it to me. And the moment I read it, I realized that at least I told myself, if this represents Islam, this is a marker from which we can move forward in a very constructive way. The main argument of that document, Common Word, was that what binds Muslims and Christians together, Muslims and Christians and Jews as well, what binds them together is the dual command to love God and to love one's neighbors. So the summary of the law and prophets that Jesus gives, the summary of the law and prophets that Apostle Paul also repeats, is the one that this large and representative communities of top Muslim scholars could make their own. Obviously, that was a significant step toward bridging what was perceived to be, and what continues to be, in fact, a very deep gap between these two faiths. As soon as I read it, I thought, oh, this is very, very important. I gathered a group of friends, and we wrote a response to that. There was a back and forth. We went back and forth in the process. I've come to know Prince Ghazi really well. We became close friends, are still close, very close friends, and organized at Yale a conference on this, and there was great hope that this initiative would continue to kind of guide the relations between Muslims and Christians. As a side remark, unfortunately, it didn't continue to do so. That is to say, the document, for whatever reason, did not live up to the promise that most of us who have read it and who participated in the process hoped from it. I hope that it can still be revived, because I think it's a fundamentally sound document, and if it can, I think this is a very important way in which we can pursue further a relationship between, improving the relationship between Muslims and Christians. And what was so significant about the document, that it, without in any way diminishing significant differences between Muslims and Christians, or Islam and Christianity, it zeroed in on what is common to us. Common, where there is something common that Muslims and Christians have, something common that's fundamental to both. Let's zero in on that rather than on the differences that often divide us. And I find that in interfaith relations, I think generally in relations between folks, we tend to emphasize and zero in on the differences, as if we are defined by our differences, as if difference defines the heart of each of these groups, rather than actually the core out of which those differences emerge, right? So, but when we emphasize the core, we often find that in the core there are significant overlaps. As we were working on these issues, obviously I was in conversation with Christians from various, from a spectrum of different positions, from very, very conservatives to very kind of liberal, trying to get a kind of broad coalition together that would respond. And in the process, 3 questions emerged for me as really important about the heart of the document. And remember, heart of the document one was what binds Muslims and Christians together is command to love God and to love neighbor. Now, I started asking myself very simple questions. I'm a simple-minded man. I ask very simple questions. Okay, so that's what binds Christians, Muslims and Christians. Okay, but is the love the same? Do we mean by love the same thing, Muslims and Christians? Do we mean by neighbor the same thing? Famously, as you know, Jesus responded with a story to a question that was given to him as a challenge, but who is my neighbor? I think that question applies also and is significant in Muslim-Christian relations. Who it is that is our neighbor? What do we mean by neighbor? Our co-religionist? Any human being in need? Who is the neighbor, right? And finally, the question that I ask myself also, do we mean the same thing by the word God? Fine, we love God. But do we love the same thing when we say that we love God? And so, and then to me, this question of do Muslims and Christians worship, or do Muslims and Christians have the same God, became key to understanding the whole process. Because if we understand under God two very different entities and realities, it doesn't help us to love God, right? To be united in loving God, when we are loving two different, maybe even opposing things. That's why I decided to write a book. Do Muslims and Christians believe in the same God? You know, I had two reactions to that book. I remember I was sitting on that fortress on the town where I grew up. On the top, there's a restaurant right now. And I was gathering about maybe 8 or so of my friends from my teenage years have gathered together. I haven't seen most of them for a long time. And we went in a circle and said, well, what's been your story this past, 30 years or so? And so it came and what are we doing now? So it came my time to talk. And I said, well, you know, this is my story, and here's what I'm working on. I'm working on the question whether Muslims and Christians believe in the same God. Now, most of these folks are really close friends of mine, were, and continue to be. Were, right? I think they continue to be. They kind of trusted me. They were a little bit proud of me. I was come from the kind of margins, and I was teaching at Yale. They also trusted in my integrity. But one person, she's a very, very close and a dear friend. She just, you could just see her stiffening her back, because I was making an argument that the Muslims and Christians worship the same God. There are differences. She stiffened her back, and she says, that can't be true. She didn't ask Miroslav, you studied this for a number of years. You're just about to publish a book, 320 pages of arguments for it, right? You had to just write it, let alone research for it, right? All of it she was kind of dimly aware, but none of it mattered one single bit. She knew the answer to this question from the get-go. I was wasting my time. I was acting like one of those intellectuals who tries to, with clever arguments, override what are obvious patent realities that any man, any woman can see when they look, right? And that's kind of reaction that I have been getting since I've written that book, in many circles. Or that's one kind of reaction that I was getting. The other kind of reaction was, you wrote 320 pages on that question? We know the answer to it, right? It's patent as day that all religions are roughly the same, and that Muslims and Christians worship the same God. What's there to write about? 320 pages. And so I had these two different audiences, often politically opposed, right? But also theologically differently configured, not quite puzzled about why is this important. And I think this kind of a puzzlement is at the person like me who will try to reconcile by taking seriously fundamental differences as well as similarities. On the more progressive side, there's nothing much to discuss in terms of religion. That's kind of settled. Let's figure out how we can cooperate together. That's roughly the sentiment that I encountered. On the other side, there's nothing to discuss on the dogmatic side. Let's divide, right? Let's make sure that we are not overrun, or kind of they were out to defend themselves. They're out to somehow secure their own boundaries, as we experience that in many situations today. Now, I found it the most interesting discussions were between somewhat more conservative Christians or between non-fundamentalist but non-progressive Christians and between non-fundamentalist and non-progressive Muslims. Those were in a sense, discussions that were worth having, that on the two sides, there are no discussions to be had, even. But I've decided, and it seemed to me at least, that it's in this middle, non-fundamentalist middle, generally theologically also non-progressive middle, that some of the key, that the key to the relations between Muslims and Christians, in fact, lies. Those who take their faith seriously, but are able to engage it in constructive ways. Now, why do I think that faith needs to be the theology? Even such question as the nature of God has to be engaged in Muslim-Christian relations. Well, I think the answer is simple. Is that for Christians and for Muslims who are monotheists, believers in one God, all fundamental values are embedded in, come from, are reflected in the nature of God. When we talk about God, we don't talk about object that's out there somewhere. And then you can say, well, you have this kind of little object there, or big object, really, really big object, right? And I have one here. Let's compare and see whose object is more interesting or something like that, right? To have a God, to worship God, means for God to have claim upon your life. There's no way to worship God without God being, for Muslims and Christians, the most important thing, in fact, in your life. But if that's true, that means that the character of God will shape the nature of the values that you as a person possess. And so if there is a claim that Muslims and Christians worship very different gods, it's a claim about different values that Muslims and Christians have. If you can make a claim, if it's true that Muslims and Christians worship at least partly the same gods, same understanding of God, they have the same understanding of God, then you will be able to say that much of their values also are overlapping. Suddenly, the question of whether Muslims and Christians believe in the same God can be translated into the following question. Do Muslims and Christians inhabit the same moral universe? And often in the debates, so the question then is, do Muslims and Christians worship in the same God? Translates at the social level. I can't repeat questions, what I said. I don't have it written, so it's all extemporaneous. But it translates at the social level in the question, do Muslims and Christians inhabit the same moral universe? So that we can actually talk to one another. So that we can, moral claims that we make have claim upon our lives. And so, for instance, if you say, if Christians and Muslims say that God is one, that God is different than the world, that God is characterized by justice and mercy, all of these things Christians and Muslims can make. And once we make them, I think the conversation about what makes justice, what makes for mercy, overlapping stories that we have in our scriptures, all of their indications of this being in the common universe, moral universe, which is to say ability to wrestle about issues of fundamental importance. The alternative is, imagine if Muslims and Christians do not inhabit the same moral universe. The only option that you have is to fight. Or maybe some compromises with which nobody is happy. So you have either moral conversation or you have non-moral struggle. Or struggle that from one side is moral, from the other side looks like the sheer deployment of violence. So that was in a sense a kind of my goal to show in this book. Not to create commonalities where they don't exist. That doesn't help anybody, right? Sometimes people have accused me of doing that. Well, you have a social goal, and then you kind of create your God of Muslims and of Christians in a way that God would serve your social goal. And I said, well, if that was what I was doing, I think that would be pretty futile. I can't make God so as to suit my ends, because what I would make would not be a God, but would be some kind of an idol, right? So I have to show, in some sense, that responsibly a conception of God can be such that it is similar in significant ways. Let me take up a bit two issues which for me have been very important in the debate, in the relations between Muslims and Christians. One of them where there is a significant commonality, and one of them where there are differences, but the differences can be productive and important to debate, right? So first, let me take you the one where there's a significant commonality. And it is a very important one in today's world. Well-known German philosopher, Sloterdijk is his name, has written that modernity is an age in which only the world can be the case. Modernity is an age in which only the world can be the case, which is to say there isn't such a thing as God. There's only world, and the only thing that you've got is the world. Now, I want to amend this statement, and I want to say, I'm not sure that's completely true, but what I'm going to just say now I think is truer than what he said and builds on his statement. I think it's true to say that modernity, that the time in which we live, I can put it maybe this way, is the time in which we live as if only the world is the case. And we live whether we believe that there is God or we don't believe that there is God. We act in the world as if only the world were the case. You know, when Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, his first temptation was after suffering hunger for some 40 days. His first temptation was what? Turn these stones into bread. Satisfy the hunger that you feel. that you have. Use your religious capacities or your magical powers. Use anything you have. If you're the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. And the response that Jesus gave was, human beings do not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Now, that statement that Jesus said in response to the tempter was not Jesus' own creation. It was in fact a quotation from the Hebrew Bible, from Deuteronomy. And it was the quotation of the statement that God gave to the children of Israel to explain why it is that they had to wander through wilderness for 40 years, so that they would learn that human beings do not live by bread alone. Now, that we live by bread, I don't think we need to learn that lesson, right? Stomach starts growling and you know you live by bread. You start shivering, bread stands here for kind of material things, right? You start shivering and you know that you need clothing. You get sick and you know that you get to be well. All these kinds of needs for which the bread stands, they are insistent upon us. But what we need to learn is that that's not the only thing, that's not the primary thing that we live by. Every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Muslims and Christians are the two worlds kinds of folks. And I'm using the idea of two worlds by quoting Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. One world being transcendent world, the world of God, of God's word, and the other world being mundane realities. We are creatures, and that's a claim of both of our faiths, we are creatures of two worlds, not just of one world. And that's why we can't live by bread alone. Indeed, all the bread that we can produce, it comes from a different source. Transcendent realities are the source of mundane realities, and that's why we really cannot simply live by mundane realities. And yet, all of our modern institutions, certainly economy, right? But the state as well, educational institutions as well, they're all organized around turning stones into bread. The most of the business of our lives is about turning stones into bread. Is about creating kind of material goods that make our lives easier, or some people think happier as well. I mentioned universities. I think it's pretty much true. There's been consistent pressure for universities to be part of the improving state of economy, right? So that you will live in a market state, and universities are supposed to deliver market results for the market, which is to say, primarily to multiply the bread. In Romans 14, which is a text from the New Testament that Apostle Paul wrote, Apostle Paul summarizes what the kingdom of God is about. What should be our major fundamental concern? And he writes, kingdom of God is not food or drink. Kingdom of God is righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit. That's a fundamental conviction of the Christian faith. I think it is also the fundamental conviction of Islam. That transcendence, that God matters profoundly more than anything in the worldly realm that we create. Not the two stand in opposition to one another, but the point is that if we live by bread alone, well, there's never enough bread if you live by bread alone. If you live by bread alone, every bite of the bread that you take has a bitter aftertaste. And you think if you had a more bread and a better bread, then aftertaste would go away, and the more bread you produce, the less satisfying the bread seems to be. Less you are also able to distribute that bread. The more bread we produce, the more folks go hungry. Isn't that a paradox? But it's true. If we live by bread alone, we become competitive. And competitiveness contributes to social disparities, to ecological destruction. Living by bread alone doesn't secure our own well-being, material well-being, let alone justice and plenitude in the world. Economic problem cannot be resolved by economic means alone. Because things aren't things, I wasn't planning to say this, but I will. Because things aren't things, is that a profound statement? That's either a dumb statement or in some ways profound. Things aren't just things. Things are always my relations to those things. You can see it if you think, some of you have iWatches, I've seen, I enviously have seen that you have iWatches. And iWatch is fine, right? But if you ask yourself, well, why does somebody have to wear golden iWatch? Because there are such golden iWatches, right? They cost $10,000, and the ordinary ones cost $500. That's expensive for a watch. 500 is expensive for a watch, but you can kind of justify it, maybe. But 10,000. Well, because watch isn't just a watch. Even that iWatch for 500 isn't just a watch. It's your relationship to that watch. The whole industry knows exactly what I'm talking about, right? We know that our investments are in things, and things are what they mean and how important they are to us. And how they're important to us is how they rank us in relationship to others. Right? And so suddenly, every single thing that we have becomes invested in our investments in that, and that in competitive relationship to our neighbors. We need to step back from things and discover new way of relating to things to be able to have ordinary justice in the world, I think. And that's why it's very good for us to think in terms of not living by bread alone. And I think here, in one of the most critical issues of our time, and mostly people don't think of it as critical issue, I do, in one of the most critical issue of our time, Muslims and Christians can stand together side by side. Now, lest this sound as a too rosy of a picture of what Islam and Christianity can do, let me maybe indicate a possible complication. So the fact that we worship a God, worship the one God who is above the world, is what binds us also together and what can relativize the importance of mundane realities in our lives. And paradoxically, that's a different lecture, help us enjoy them even better. But there's also difference. And I want to end with just a gesture toward explaining a bit of a significant difference, which I believe is something that ought to be discussed and debated, and productive relationships can exist not only where we agree, but also where we disagree in a productive way. Now, one of the things that we debated during the Common Word conferences, after those Common Word conferences, was the nature of love and how love is related to the nature of God. Now, that seems like a terribly abstract question, right? Up there in the stratosphere. And yet it is very close to life. Here's what the distinction was, and the debate was. Can we say that God is love? Or should we only say that God loves? God is love, or God loves? Now, I think there's a difference between the two. And the difference, roughly, in my mind, comes to this. If I say that God is love, then it follows that God cannot but love. All actions of God are expressions of that which God is. It also means that God's love is not reactive, is not a reaction to the state of things that are before God. It's not, oh, okay, if this piece of reality, if this person ends up being lovable, then I'm going to love them. And if they end up being not so lovable, then I'm not. I'm going to have a different attitude toward them. I might be angry with them. I might be punitive toward them. I may do different things toward them, right? But I'm not going to love them. Or I will not understand my anger. It will not be expression of my love. It's going to be a kind of distinct emotion from that. I think that much of the Christian faith flows from the conviction that God is love. I think also the debate between Muslims and Christians about nature of the Trinity, unicity of God and Trinity are tied to this question. Nature of Christ coming into the world, the death on the cross of Christ depends on this question. Apostle Paul's doctrine of justification of ungodly. Remember, ungodly are justified, not those who try to be godly but can't quite succeed. Ungodly are justified, right? Now, from the Muslim side, justification of ungodly, and not just from Muslim side, from Jewish side, from any reasonable person side, who hasn't made a shift to think from the Christian vantage point, this seems like an appalling doctrine. Why would you justify somebody who's ungodly, right? How could you do that? Isn't that injustice? And you can go down the line, how you must align yourself with what the good is, or at least strive to align yourself with what the good is, so that you can be affirmed in what you're doing. Otherwise, you're being affirmed basically in your kind of twisted forms of living. That's tied, I think, to the question whether God loves or God is love. And those two questions, I think, you can see how they might run through the entire fabric of not just Muslim-Christian relations, but also relations with other communities. What is the nature of a mercy of God? Is there place for the mercy of God? That can be asked with regard to many other positions. In Islam, mercy is a very central one. For Christians, what is the place of unconditional love? The whole way of thinking about human beings changes once you affirm unconditional love. All of this is simply to illustrate to you that Islam and Christianity, or I can put it this way, varieties of Islam and Christianity, like the varieties of other religions, they each have a kind of conception of who human beings are, how they relate to themselves, how they relate to others. And I think the most important contribution of great world religions is to give us accounts of what may be described as true life. Those accounts differ often. And the discussion about those, a truth-seeking discussion about various accounts of what makes for true life, is one of the most pressing needs of our time. Reason why I say that's one of the most pressing needs of our time is that there are no other places, there are very few other places left, except for religious traditions and some philosophical schools, where that question is taken up in a sustained way. This is the most important question of our lives. Most important question of my life is, what does it mean for me to succeed? Not in any of single endeavors that I undertake. What does it mean for me to succeed in the endeavor that is my life itself? What does it mean for me to succeed as a human being? Great world religions, Islam and Christianity, they have varieties of answers to this question. They have entertained this question for centuries, for millennia. They're repositories of immense wisdom about what it means to be a human being, a truthful life of a human being. And we today, especially in the modern West, in the not just West, but anywhere where kind of modernity and globalizing processes have kind of penetrated into consciousness of the people, we tend not to ask that question. We ask the question, what do I want? What's my preference? And we ask the question, how do I get what I want? We shape the idea of what do I want by reading consumer reports a little bit, but looking also at our neighbors. What they want, I kind of want with slight distinction or something of that sort. We have a relatively quick fixes to the question of what I want. We don't ask even the question, what do I really want? Is the want that is immediately pressing a want that actually is what I want, my true want? We almost never ask the question, what is truly worth wanting? The fact that you really want something, right, doesn't yet mean that it's really worth wanting. Doesn't mean that you should invest your time and energy in the one life that you have to achieve that. So question of what's really worth wanting, it's tied to the question, who are you? Who are you as a human being? And in all of our activities, in successes and failures, we enact a vision of ourselves as human beings. And yet we never or rarely think about what's worth wanting, who it is worth for me to actually be. Now again, Islam and Christianity may disagree on kind of answers they give to this question. But for both of them, this will be one of the central questions with which they occupy themselves. And to the extent that it becomes marginal for us, and for many Christians, I'll speak for Christians, has become marginal. I believe it's a betrayal of the fundamental faith that we are called to embody. Jesus Christ, when he came, did not say, who wants to become a Christian? He said, come and follow me. Become as I am. Right? A kind of identity that religion confers to us is rather irrelevant thing from the deeper push of religion. What is fundamental is who are you with relation to the transcendence, to the one who created you and who created you to fulfill your being and destiny as a human being. Each of us in our own ways, each of us are unique, but each of us in alignment with the transcendent call that we have. That's why I'm interested in Islam and Christianity and their relations, not so much simply to ward off the conflicts, which is what generally people talk about it, but how can we come together to emphasize the importance of transcendence in our lives against this flattening push of contemporary life, how can we also retrieve the serious conversation about what it means to succeed as a human being? And these two questions are in fact aspects of one single question. That's what I think ought to be at the heart of the encounter between Islam and Christianity. That's what I think ought to be at the heart of the encounter between great world religions, and I take it also great world philosophies as well. Thank you very much. I'm happy to field questions, so yes?
What do you feel is the best way to kind of engage in that dialogue, that discussion, that conversation amongst people like the folks here?
Yeah. I think that, can you hear me? Well, yes, I will repeat the question. So what do I think is the best way to engage in these kinds of discussions among by ordinary people? How do ordinary people address those issues? The best way that I know, and I've had some experience with it, is what sometimes is described as scriptural reasoning. And roughly it translates simply into this. People get together and you read one day portion of Quran and discuss it, and the other day you read portion of the Bible and discuss that. I found it always very helpful and enlightening, because if I discuss my convictions, Muslims come together and we Christians come, I say what my convictions are, we discuss them. I kind of feel defensive of my convictions. I need to kind of explain and I need to defend them and so forth. And suddenly it turns into less of a learning and more of a kind of a bit of a struggle, too much of a struggle that kind of prevents learning. But if you have your holy books, here's what the holy book says. I don't say it. I may agree with it or not, but this is what the holy book says. Now let's read this. Let's explore this. And I found that, I'm pretty committed to the Bible as a source of my theology, my life. God speaks, I think, through the Bible. But I found that in encounters with people reading the Bible from a different angle, I went away enriched. I suddenly said, wow, that's there, right? And suddenly I feel, well, this conversation is very productive because they see the text, which I think is authoritative to me, in a very different way. I can see it in a different way, and it can speak to me in a very new and fresh ways. And yet now we have a movement of encounter with one another without sacrificing in any way my identity, either of our identities. I find that really very helpful.
Will there be any benefit in understanding the history of this question, that do Muslims and Christians believe in the same God? Because originally that was not even there. Quran describes Jesus more times than Muhammad.
Yeah.
So sometimes later this question must have come up, and maybe it was politically motivated or any other distress. Can you give us a little bit of history as to where this question might have come up originally and how it was propagated?
Yeah, that's the history of that question. It's useful in the book that I've written on this called Allah, A Christian Response. I give some of the history from mainly from the Christian standpoint. It's true what you say that Quran speaks a lot about Jesus, but I think where fundamentally the question arose was the claims in Quran that God does not have associates, and reading of Christian doctrine, Christians' claims about Jesus as if Jesus were God's associate. So basically the sense was Christians worship Jesus. Worshipping Jesus must mean compromising the divine unicity, and therefore you have to rethink of who Jesus was, right? For Christians, that looked very differently, right? The Christians have spent 3-4 centuries thinking deeply and carefully and arguing about how to think about Jesus Christ as divine without sacrificing unicity of God, right? And so I think a lot of debates were early on around that very issue. I try to address the issue in my book, and there are ways in which we can address that book and address the issue. But it's a significant issue. I remember I was driving. I was in Dubai, and I had a good Muslim friend who was in Abu Dhabi. Went and visited him. We were driving back home, and I'm telling him, Habib Ali, what do you think? Do Muslims and Christians believe in the same God? And he says, yeah, of course I believe Muslims and Christians believe in the same God. I said, Habib Ali, but aren't you making things too easy for yourself and for me? And so I give some of these claims about the Quran, right? As God not having associates, and kind of he steps back a little bit, but said, but Ron Williams, at that time he was Archbishop of Canterbury, gave a lecture in Al-Azhar University, and then in this lecture he talked about, those were his words, that Christians believe that God is numerically one. They're not three of them sitting next to each other, and that's now Holy Trinity, right? God is numerically one, even though Jesus is divine. Said, Ron Williams kind of explained that. And I said, but do you know, Habib Ali, that Ron Williams said nothing new? This is what Christians have believed for centuries. And he thinks a little bit and says, Miroslav, do you have time to go to the offices of my foundation for us to discuss that this evening? I had a flight next morning early from Dubai. And my response to Habib Ali was, of course I have time, Habib Ali. And so we stayed late in the evening discussing how this very issue. How do we think of unicity of God in such a way that Christians on the one hand can worship Jesus, on the other hand, the oneness of God is not compromised. Yes?
Thank you, Dr. Miroslav. It's very interesting. I wanted to ask you about our Christian and Muslim engagement in secular culture, in a liberal democracy, where the difficult question you asked about what is true life? What is true life? What's the question we should ask each other, that we're asking in a context which is secular, and in a liberal democracy involves secularism. So there's a separation of church and state, and so on and so forth. And the issue of the religious bleeding of our congregations and our mosques, where our young people are leaving and finding community inspiration in very secular terms. So the question of what is a true good life can also be devoid of a religious significance for a lot of our people. Common ground is often in secular culture, especially for our young people who haven't been prepared to live in a pluralistic society. And I would just be interested in your comments about that.
Yeah. Has everybody heard the question? Yes. Yeah. I think that is one very, very important question. In a sense, that's what I was trying to attend to in the last part of my talk. Certainly, for many Muslims and Christians of a younger generation, secularism becomes an attractive alternative to their own communities. I think basically my position is we need to be engaged in what I described as truth-seeking conversations across those dividing lines. Now, we live in pluralistic settings. And in pluralistic settings, we will have groups butting against each other. And I think a way to deal with this, obviously to have encounters with one another, to learn about ways of living that each other has, but to engage in a search for what is the truth of our existence. This is, I think, most important question of our lives. To do it also with secularists. Often they have very deep reflection on that question. You just think of kind of secular forms of existentialism. and how deeply that question was maybe unsatisfactory, but there was wrestling with that question. So I'd like to retrieve for us that. In fact, that's what we do. I teach a course at Yale. It's called Life Worth Living, and that's exactly what we do. We take about 7, 8 philosophies, religions, and look at them by asking the question, what do they say about what is truly life worth living? And then engage in a discussion, debate. Generally, we describe it as truth-seeking. They make claims to be true. Take them seriously in those claims and engage in them in seriousness. I think for that to happen at the kind of level of wider public and not simply in our educational institutions, I think we need framework. We need a different way to think about liberal democracy. I certainly wouldn't want to concede the idea that liberal democracy is secular. I wouldn't even want to concede that there should be a wall of separation between church or religion and state. There's a distinction, important distinction. And there should be something like neutrality of the state toward all comprehensive views, right? And that would then make it possible for religious folks on equal footing to bring their own vision of the visions of the good life into the public debate. I think that both secularists and religionists have a kind of totalitarian temptation or authoritarian temptation. Secularists think those irrational religionists push them out of the public life. Religious people think those amoral, godless secularists push them out of the public life. One and the other side, we all like democracy, but we have hard time with pluralistic kind of liberal democracy, in which we would create spaces also for one another and engage in these broader debates. For that, we need slightly different political philosophy, and we also need a slightly attuned religious understanding of our relation, of our place in public sphere. Give you a plug for a book of mine called Flourishing: Why We Need Religion in a Globalized World. I attend to that question. Yes, I'm looking at this side only, and then there we go. Okay.
Coming along with your idea of the importance of transcendence, I believe that every human being alive has spirituality. It's a search for something more in my life, a search for what makes sense of my life. And if we can look at ourselves in that perspective, then we can overarch the varying religions as well as the secular. If we can see that the person who is acquiring a lot of stuff is also at the same time at certain crucial points in that person's life asking a more fundamental question of who am I?
Yeah.
And what do I need? And what kind of difference do I make? And that can transcend the whole question.
The question can transcend, right? Whether the answers that we give can be often compatible. I find that in many instances, the answers to, once you start asking this question, you might get to the point where answers become incompatible and you're highly invested in them, and you've got to negotiate them, those differences. But I'm with you on this. Yes.
Since like the main question was like how do Christians and Muslims flourish together, what did Christians think about Muslims like back then?
Back when?
Like
Many centuries ago, or yeah. So since the topic, so here's the question. Since the topic is how can Muslims and Christians flourish together, what did Christians think of Muslims in the past? That's a very good question, right? Because the way in which Christians thought about Muslim over the centuries, or inverted, the way in which Muslims thought about Christians and acted toward Christians, both of them, right? Put differently, our memories of our common experiences together, stories that we tell, they shape the way in which we act today. We know that memory of crusades play a significant role in both in terms of certain forms of resurgence of Islam, but also in certain forms of counter measures on the Christian side, especially in the wake of colonization. These painful histories of remembering, we need to bring them up, and in order to be able to flourish together, we will need to somehow also attend to our common past. That may be a step in the future, or that may be something that individual groups attend in their own local levels and then broader, but I think it will have to be a thing to significantly attend to. Thank you for this question. I have one question here. How much time do we have? I'm not watching. 4 minutes?
Yes.
Okay.
I agree with you 100% that we need to know, we need to determine who God is. If I have to love God with all my heart, mind, soul, and strength, it makes a big difference who God is. And because I had a friend at one time who was a Muslim, who I cared about very much, I decided to find out, to compare Islam and Christianity, step by step, or point by point, to see not which is right, but what they both said based on their holy books, as best as I could. And what I came up with is this book called The Complex One and The Simple One. And that title emphasizes what they have in common, one, and how they are different. Islam worships the simple God, Allah, and Christianity worships the complex God, the Trinity, or Yahweh. And I think, one more point, Jesus said, we live by every word from the mouth of God. Now, if we took the Old Testament, if we took the New Testament, and we took the Quran, and we took them all seriously and studied them and determined for ourselves which one was right, I think that we might be on the right.
Thank you. I'm not sure that I need to comment. The only comment that I would make is that, you know, Christians have always said, at least since Augustine, that God is simple. meaning that God, by that meaning, God is not composite. Right? God is not made up of parts that you can lop off.
But he is complex.
I have one more question here, and do I have time for one more? So, Professor Mahan, and one more question, and then I think I have to conclude. Or I'll let Susan. I'll just answer. Well, why do I worry about this, right? That's kind of crazy. Let her worry about this.
Thank you very much, Professor Volf, for this. I want to ask you about this central question that you're asking about whether Muslims and Christians believe in the same God, as translating socially into the issue of whether Muslims and Christians inhabit the same moral universe. And the implication being that if they don't, it will lead to conflict or war. And does that mean that in order for there to be peace, people have to share the same core theologies? And can there be no peace with different theologies?
There can be peace, right? But it would be unstable peace. If there are no, I'm not sure that we will need common theologies, but one needs the common set of moral convictions. And common set of moral convictions that binds people, because otherwise you might have them cohabiting in the same place, but living in peace might be too strong. Obviously, you have people living in peace who who don't worship a God at all, or who have, say, for instance, Buddhists do not believe in God, are religious folks. But for Muslims and Christians, the moral convictions are fundamentally enshrined in their visions of God. So if, for instance, Muslims say that Christians worship an idol, that makes it more difficult to live in peace together. Vice versa, I think, is true as well. One more.
Yeah, I guess my question is kind of similar to that, but I feel that when we try and have these conversations and bring Christian Muslims together, there's this tendency to oversimplify our commonalities and maybe draw parallels between things that aren't necessarily parallel, like even just like Muhammad and Jesus or the Quran.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I'm wondering, how do you kind of reconcile that? How do you, at what point do you push past the similarities and focus on the differences? And then I don't know, how do you kind of have these conversations without the differences getting in the way of making peace, of coexisting?
So I take it that Muslims and Christians are lovers of truth because they're lovers of God. Now, we sometimes confuse being lover of truth and being possessor of truth. And those are two very different things, I think. And that's why I talk about the truth-seeking communities. Of course, we make truth assertions as well, but we seek the truth. But you can't seek just the truth by affirming your own truth. That's not truth-seeking, right? You have to, whatever you discover as true, you will affirm in the other. In fact, you will, as Apostle Paul says, rejoice in the truth. So if somebody says something true, and I thought that they thought differently, and then they say something true from within their own religion, I think my responsibility is to rejoice. It's a good thing. And so you can make discriminating judgments. I think where the thing is difficult a line to draw, it sometimes is how much commonality does it need to be? And that's in a sense where Professor Mahan was pushing the question. I think it's a very, very important question to push. How much commonality must there be for you to be able to kind of live together in peace, to recognize this as something important, something that binds, and is not something that is simply, oh, sure, we all have 5 fingers, right? That's true too, you know? But it fundamentally doesn't shape our lives, right? And doesn't, or what shapes what doesn't, what directs what doesn't. Those are some of the critical issues. And I think something like desire also to be together in peace, certain form of love, I would argue also, is a condition of possibility of recognizing and valorizing properly the truth, right? If you, it could be that certain forms of truth, they're true, but they don't matter to you. What matters to you is simply that which is different, right? So what I'm calling for is not only to recognize the overlapping convictions, but somehow to rejoice in them, to find that as a good, because you and I, human beings, belong together to the same community. You can apply it to all sorts of relationships in which we are, right? It fits there as well.
We could talk all day. Thank you, Miroslav. Wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.